Hey, everybody. We're going to take a few minutes here, and I want to get you moving along as we continue our way through the Cold War. The goal is to kind of finish up the Cold War either by Friday or if we need to into Monday and Tuesday. So, to go forward, I'm going to go back just slightly. In 1961, Democratic Senator John F. Kennedy was elected president. And at his inaugural address in 1961, he uttered a fairly famous phrase of, "We shall pay any price, bear any burden, meet any hardship, support any friend, oppose any foe, to assure the survival and success of liberty." Again, I think it's a nice piece of rhetoric. It sounds good, but it really does reflect the U.S. or his intent to continue the U.S. commitment to containment. I think it's reflecting the idea that the United States had already intervened in Korea, in Vietnam, in Southeast Asia, in the Middle East, intervened in Egypt, in Iran, in Central America, in Guatemala, and continued to vouch for the defense of Europe. So it really was this idea that the United States is going to try to be everything to anybody in pursuit of containment. By the time the 1970s came around, though, there seemed to be definitely a shift in how the United States perceived its place in the world. So, this era of the 1970s is often referred to as the era of détente, which is a French word, somehow means relaxing. You have to ask Madame Marin. But what it means in American foreign policy history is that it's a relaxing of tensions between the United States and the perceived communist world. If you see down at the bottom right there, there's an image from Newsweek magazine of President Richard Nixon traveling to China in 1972. On the surface, that doesn't sound like a very big deal, but keep in mind that up until this point, the United States government had not officially recognized the communist government as China as a legitimate government. That's one of the powers of the presidency, is to decide what is a country and what is not. It's called the recognition powers. And until President Nixon, the United States had never recognized China's communist government. So this image, this event kind of reflects this whole idea that it was trying to relax tensions between the United States and the communist world. Big question is, why was there this shift? And I want to make sure that this doesn't necessarily mean that the United States ended the Cold War. It doesn't mean that we were forming alliances with the communist world, but it was trying to back off from some of the tensions that had existed prior. So again, the question of why did the United States pursue this policy? I think you have to start with Vietnam. Um, Up until Vietnam, the United States had never really suffered a clear and obvious inability to achieve its foreign policy goals. The United States, the wealthiest, most technologically capable country in the world, was unable to achieve its goals against relatively small, relatively technologically inferior Vietnam. And it shook not only American public confidence in the United States' ability to act as this kind of global policeman, and that term became kind of a way to criticize the United States interventions around the world. The very same interventions that President Kennedy had celebrated and supported in his inaugural address. Um, it also left the international community questioning the ability of the United States to live up to the commitments that it had been making since 1945 under President Truman. So Vietnam had a fairly profound impact on how the United States saw itself and how other countries saw us as well. Secondly, the economy of the 1970s was unstable, to say the least. The United States went through several different shocks caused by rapid rates of inflation. There was an economic malaise, meaning, again, production slowed down. So there was a desire of people, by people in the United States and by policymakers, to shift our resources towards more domestic concerns. If you pardon the flipping for a moment, what you see before you is a chart showing defense spending as a percentage of gross domestic product. And we've seen a chart like this before. If you look on the left side, you see that spike there in 1944. Obviously, that is U.S. defense spending during World War II, spiking up to 35% of the total national gross domestic product. We see the rapid decline in the late 1940s, and as the Cold War really ramped up, we see this small little peak again in 1953. As you go forward the 60s, you see this bump up in 1968. Again, that's definitely the peak of escalation during the Vietnam War. But if you look at the era between 1968 and 1985, we see a 3% decrease in overall defense spending as a percentage of GDP. So we see some of the economic impact of those decisions on defense spending. It still left us as definitely the largest military spender in the world, but it definitely tried to shift, or the era of detente tried to shift resources away from foreign policy concerns into domestic concerns. The last major factor of why detente happened is that for President Nixon and his national security advisor, Henry Kissinger, the guy with the lovely voice, Kissinger definitely had a realist perspective. If you think back to our perspectives on foreign policy, a realist tends not to think in terms of what is moral in the sense of right and wrong, but rather that countries pursue interests rather than values. And Kissinger definitely thought this way. He didn't perceive that the Cold War was a fight between good nations and evil nations, that there was a moral rightness and wrongness to the Cold War, but rather they were merely countries who had legitimate national security concerns and they were going to compete with those countries. But in the meantime, he also thought that it was important that the United States try to find common ground with those nations in order to perceive our national security goals, not all of which he thought needed to be seen in the lens of the Cold War. And that's an important thing that's taking place here in the 1970s. Through the 50s and 60s, increasingly more and more conflicts around the world, legitimately or not, came to be seen as part of the Cold War struggle. A good example of that is the Vietnam War itself. The United States saw this as part of the Cold War, but to the people of Vietnam, this was a war for independence. This was a civil war. So the era of detente showed that the United States was trying to walk back tensions between the United States and the communist world. You're now going to go on to Google Classroom, and there will be a map series that you're going to be taking a look at and doing an analysis of in order to understand what the impact of detente was on the international world map.